and I so appreciate that. It's a wonderful blessing, and we are greatly blessed that the men here are so willing. If I had a complaint from pre-K through 12th grade and on up into what is referred to as higher education, I think one of my biggest complaints would be they'll give you all the knowledge you can get in. Problem is, they don't teach wisdom.
Show you how to use it.
And our Father is not so concerned about you in calculus. What he is concerned about is wisdom. There's huge sections of our canon that are devoted to simply trying to teach us how to not be a fool, how to navigate our way through life. And one of the most important things that I have found is asking the right question. Changes everything. Most successful criminal investigations are accomplished by asking the right question.
Comes right out of the criminal's own mouth.
Yep. So it's important for us because that requires self-examination. And I want each of us to ask ourselves this morning, where do I have my worth? It's a very important aspect of life. Well, I lost my clicker. I lost my clicker, Nick. But we'll make it through. I'd like to share with you, if you will, allow me, the story of this young fella right here. His name is Wallace Henry Hartley. Now, some that may click right off, others, stay with me. Wallace was born in 1878. He died in 1912 at the young age of 33. It's interesting, isn't it? That age of 33. Wallace was born in Colin, England. And at about the age of 5, he really showed an interest in the violin. He came by naturally, his father was the choir master at the Methodist church where they attended. And so Wallace asked a local congregant, will you teach me the violin at 5 years old? By the time he was 10, he was a prodigy. Loved music. Now, as a lot of fathers will do, Albion came to Wallace and said, you do not want to make a living with music. You need to go into banking. And so he did. He went down, got a job at the local bank in his early 20s, and there he was quite successful. People liked Wallace. They moved from Colin to Huddersfield. And about that time, Wallace couldn't resist any longer. He joined the Philharmonic. And he went back to playing the violin. And then he never stopped. Somewhere in this stretch of his 20s, he decided, you know, I think I'd like to see the world. So I'm going to couple these two loves together. and he got a job with a talent agency, and he started working for the Cunard shipping lines. And Wallace made scores of transatlantic crossings, back and forth. In 1910, Wallace got down on one knee and asked the love of his life, Maria Robinson, "Will you marry me?" She said yes. Now, Wallace came from poor and meager means. Maria's father was a very wealthy man. He had made his living in cloth and textiles. And Maria went out and she bought Wallace a violin, and she had this silver plate engraved and put on the neck for Wallace on the occasion of our engagement from Maria. He treasured that. He kept it with him. He used it. He continued to have success. And he got a promotion. He got a promotion, and the White Star Cruise Line came to Wallace and said, "We want you to be our bandmaster." White Star came to him and said, "You know what? We're going to put you on the maiden voyage of the Titanic." And Maria was very nervous about this, it said. Really, I think she was nervous not because of the transatlantic crossing, but because he was having so much success. When am I going to get this boy nailed down? Their engagement now had been for 2 years. And Wallace told Maria, "When I get back from this cruise, we're getting married." Wallace here in the middle with his bandmates. April the 10th, she started towards New York. And you know what happened on April the 14th. It was a foggy, sleet-filled night. There were 2 young men up in the crow's nest with their eyes peeled. And just before midnight, they screamed down to the bridge, "Iceberg, dead ahead." Evasive action was taken. They really did their best to go to port, but it was too little, too late, and she was ripped down the starboard side. Captain Smith knew pretty quick this wasn't going to go well, and he gave the order to abandon ship. Now, as it should go, women and children were first. But it's utter chaos. People are terrified. They didn't get the, have you been on a cruise where they make you go to your muster stations?
Yeah.
And what did Wallace do?
Played.
Wallace got his bandmates together, and he went out onto the deck and he began playing music. because he wanted to calm people down. He wanted to do what he could to help people as they were facing a life and death situation. You know, when I learned of this story, it made me think of this poem. Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem, If. In 1910, he wrote it for his 12-year-old son, and he wanted to teach his son how to be a man. And this poem goes into beautiful detail on integrity and in courage. And this is the opening line to If. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs. It's a tremendous sign of character. Well, you've seen the movies. You've read the books. And the story goes that as Wallace was on that deck and the ship is continuing to tilt and take on those icy waters, and he knows there is not a seat for him on any of those lifeboats. His chance of survival, nil. And he knows that this is the end. He had talked about this prior. You know, when this is what you do for a living, you should, if you're wise, consider what might be. And he had actually spoken to a fellow bandmate years before. If I'm ever on a sinking ship, I will play one of two songs. I will play either Nearer My God to Thee, or I will play Our God, Our Help in Ages Past. There are eyewitness accounts. There was a little girl by the name of Eva Hart. She was 7 years old. She was taking this trip with her mother and her father. Eva and her mother were on a lifeboat. Her father died. But Eva testified years later, I heard them play Nearer My God to Thee. She was already away from the ship. But on a cold, freezing, still night, sound travels over water. If you don't know, ask anyone who's ever lived on a body of water. You can hear conversations from a mile away. This is part of one of the books. Even amid the tumult, his last words are said to have resounded clearly. Gentlemen, I bid you farewell. With that, Wallace Hartley, band leader of the Titanic, was washed away with his precious violin in its case, strapped to his waist. You know, we want heroes. And I think here the author took what we say is poetic license. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered. Imagine this. The Nova Scotia Coast Guard was tasked for weeks afterwards to go out daily and recover the flotsam and the bodies from the Titanic. Wallace Hartley was recovered 2 weeks later, frozen in the Atlantic with his life vest on, along with 2 of his bandmates. And they took an inventory of everything that was on each person. And when they brought Wallace aboard, he had a golden cigar holder, and he had a silver match box and 2 letters in his pockets. That was it. But the violin wasn't lost. They also found his suitcase. This is a telegram written from Maria Robinson back to the Nova Scotia Coast Guard. And in this letter, she says, "I would be most grateful if you could convey my heartfelt thanks to all who have made possible the return of my late fiance's violin. May I take this opportunity to express my appreciation to you personally for your gracious intervention on my behalf." Now, they found it inside of a piece of luggage. So evidently, after he finished playing, he put it in its case and he locked it into the luggage, and then he was washed away. Well, was it lost forever? After Maria Robinson died in 1939 at the age of 59, she never married. She grieved her fiance. And she gave that violin to her sister, Margaret. Margaret had no use for that violin. She knew a man by the name of Major Renwick, and she gave it to him. He knew a band teacher who played for the Salvation Army, and it wound up at the Salvation Army. The band teacher then gave that violin to one of her students by the name of Eve, and there it remained with Eve. Eve's son, Eve passed away in 1980, and Eve's son in 2006 went up into her attic because he had played with this violin as a kid, and he pulled it out and he saw the initials WHH, and he read the engraved back, and he turned it over to an auction house that spent the next 7 years tracking this violin in an attempt to authenticate it, to which they did. It went up for auction in the year 2013. And there it sold for £1,185,000. Maria paid £40 back in 1910. And with inflation, that's somewhere around $2,600. It was a very nice gift. When it went up for auction, they set a floor price of $100,000. And they thought, that's about half of what it's going to go for. And when it was within 10 minutes, it was up and past 200,000, heading to 300,000, 500,000. Most everybody that was there in person was outbid. There were 4 bidders afterwards that took over. At 750,000 pounds, they say the room went dead silent. These are 4 people who are so rich, they don't even have to show up. The final sales price was 900,000 pounds. but you don't get away without paying the tax man. After the value-added tax, it comes to the £1,185,000. Why? Why?
Touching the master's hand.
It's not even playable, folks. Now think about that. A violin is a vessel, and the work that it can do, this violin isn't even capable of.
Because of the story behind it.
Because Wallace showed courage. His last song wasn't Turkey in the Straw or Camptown Races. His last song was a prayer to God, because that's what it was for him. His last song was Nearer, My God, to Thee. It shows courage. It shows faith. It shows leadership. He infused all of that into this violin. You know, when I think of this story, it makes me hearken back to a poem Trundy's grandfather, Trudy's dad, would recite this poem at special occasions. It's called The Touch of the Master's Hand, because it speaks to worth. Why was Wallace's violin worth anything? "'Twas battered and scarred, and the auctioneer thought it scarcely worth his while to waste much time on the old violin, but held it up with a smile. 'What am I bidding, good folks?' he cried. 'Who'll start the bidding for me? $1? $1. Then 2? Only 2? $2. Who'll make it 3? $3 once, $3 twice. Going for 3, but no. From the room far back came a gray-haired man, and he picked up the bow. Then wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening the loosened strings, he played a melody pure and sweet as a caroling angel sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, with a voice quiet and low, said, "What am I bid for the old violin?" as he held it up with the bow. 1,000? 1,000. And who'll go 2? 2,000? 2,000. And who'll go 3? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice. Going and gone, said he. The people cheered, but some of them cried, "We do not quite understand. What changed its worth?" And swift came the reply, "'Twas the touch of the master's hand. 'Twas the touch of the master's hand." And many a man with life out of tune, battered and scarred by sin, is auctioned cheap to the thoughtless crowd, much like the old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He's going once, he's going twice, he's almost gone. But the master comes. and the foolish crowd never can quite understand the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of the Master's hand. That was written in 1921 by Myra Welch. Why did it gain any worth at all? In Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7, Paul tells us, in Jesus Christ, and we just talked about this at the Lord's Supper, Jim, we are redeemed. That's a financial term. Paul says, in Jesus, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. Where does your worth come from? Is it a bank account? Possessions? Even family? In Revelation chapter 4 and into chapter 5, John is given a spiritual vision of the throne room of God. And in this vision, John says in verse 8, now, when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Now, John is crying in this vision, if you remember. And the reason John is crying is because the scroll has 7 seals. And they've searched all of heaven and they can't find anybody worthy. They searched all of earth and they can't find anybody worthy to open the scroll. And an elder comes to John and he says, stop crying. The Lamb is worthy. Now, before we go to the next, I want you guys to remember, when we come together and we pray, don't act like that's nothing. Don't think that that's just a ritual. Don't think that this is just a process that we're going through. Where are your prayers? What does he say? Your prayers are in the throne room of God, and they fill the golden bowl of incense, the prayers of the saints. Never forget that. And they sang a new song. What do they do in heaven? They do what we do right here. They pray. They sing. And they sang a new song saying to Christ, you are worthy to take the scroll, to open its seals, for you were slain, and you have redeemed us to God by your blood, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and you have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. Christ is worthy. Why? Because he was slain and he lived the perfect life. You are worthy because you have the blood of Christ, the forgiveness of sins. Without that, what do we have? Where did you contact that blood? What does John 3 say? In the water. What does Romans 6 say? You're united in your baptism in his death. Galatians 3, you put on Christ in baptism. Self-examine. Be thankful to God for his grace, for the sacrifice of his son, for the fact that we are worthy as his children. Okay. I thank you for your attention. And Jason, do we have a closing song?
Yeah.